be to God.
Thank you, Don. We speak by faith today. We speak of it and we reflect our experiences, both its ups and downs. A few summers ago, Beth and I went to Kenya on a mission trip. She'd been once before, and I've followed. This is a mission trip that's sponsored by Hope United Methodist Church, our sister church in South Denver. And part of what I want to share with you today is our experience there in the Meru district in Warera. But each time we saw a sermon, participated in worship there, the pastor would start with these exact words from St. Paul. They would say, "I am Steve Warren, God's servant, convicted by Jesus Christ and saved by God's grace to share with you this message from the Scriptures. May God be pleased with what I have to say to you today, and may God convict you this morning into salvation." A little bit of urgency there, isn't there? Very impressive. St. Paul's letter to the Hebrews records the history of God's people as they struggled, relying solely upon the Lord for their courage and strength. The writer of the Hebrews articulates the kind of suffering and humiliation and stress that we can only picture in our nightmares. About the time they talked about being sawn in two, my mind kind of went blank. A price hard for us to imagine for the privilege of bearing true faith and allegiance to Jesus Christ, who is our Savior. It's a humbling reminder reading these passages, though we may avoid expressing our faith in public, the Jesus way for millions and millions of Christians around the world is to do just that. We're called to account by St. Paul to bear a willing witness to the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who is Jesus. We are convicted and convinced to speak up about our reliance upon God and the many blessings of our living faith. And more importantly, we're called to live by our faith, not just by our wits. I like the story of a beautiful lake that provided for many years fresh water for the farm it was on. The water formerly had been clear, but now had lost its zesty freshness. Its allure to animals and people alike began to fade. It began like some of the lakes around here, covered with blue-green algae and pond scum. The farm animals became ill when they drank from it. And finally, someone came by the lake who understood the problem. Debris from the spring rains had stopped up the dam and prevented the free flow of water, not into the lake, but out of the lake. So the spillway was cleared, and soon the lake was fresh and clean again. The flow in and out were necessary to keep the water pure. What does this mean to us? A simple principle applies to you and me as human beings. The blessings of life flow to us, but if we fail to realize that most of these blessings are meant not just to flow to us, but through us, that we can start to feel kind of sick. If we don't realize that God's blessings are shared with us, not just so that we can gather them up and enjoy them, but that we can turn loose of them for others, we kind of lose our way. Our blessings are meant for the good of others around us, especially for those in need. And I know there are times that we feel so much in need, so alone with our trials and troubles, so beset by the difficulties that life brings us that we scarcely know if we're going to be able to get up out of bed in the morning. And yet, even in these situations, there are blessings. And these blessings help us realize God's gift. The team to Kenya, in the Meru district, in the shadow of Mount Kenya, at the center of the country in Africa, were greeted when we arrived by 150 years of Kenyan Methodist and British Methodist work before us. For there they had nurtured in the people a remarkable faith and a reliance upon God. Among other places, we were 10 days in impoverished primary school at Warera, which literally means a very dry place. You think about Colorado and you minus about 10 inches of rain, you've got Guerrera. So our mission there was to build a greenhouse, was to dig an irrigation system. It was to establish a small library for the public school. We also put skylights in the classrooms and laid concrete floors, most of which had dirt. We established hand washing stations and arranged a clinic for which over 466 people came traveling, some over 10 miles by foot, because they hadn't had any medical care for the last 6 years. These people who we met and worked side by side with live on the edge of survival. Many truly do not know where their next meal will come from. And although it's hard for us to imagine, the world is full with people living in these exact conditions. One of the astonishing things we frequently encountered, however, was a people in their willingness to count on God. To count on God for the essentials of life. To count on God for their next meal. To count on God for the hope of their hearts because their circumstance were crushing and the poverty was unbearable. We travelers with our comfortable shoes and our bottled water and our ready resources, we were made all the more strangers in a strange land by the timidity of our own faith, our in practice in sharing what God had done for us in the presence of these people who at the drop of a hat would speak plainly about what God had done for them, their Christ-like openness, their willing faith. We who were, by worldly standards, rich as kings, were pitiable in our poverty of faith, myself included. Friends, the fastest part of our entire worldwide United Methodist Church is among people who are needy beyond imagining. People who are ready to share what God means to them. The focal point and power of our Methodist movement is not here in the United States, where comforts and privileges abound. But it is alive in people halfway around the world whose attitude toward Jesus is so open and whose willingness to suffer for him is so apparent that it beggars our pale version of Christianity. We were humbled. I was humbled to be in their presence as we worked on these things side by side. Most of the time we spent there in the Methodist Biointensive Agricultural Center. That's one of the missions that we support through our United Methodist apportionments in the worldwide church. And there the primary focus is to train Kenyan farmers to attain food security. Crops may come, crops may not, but the family remains hungry. And so they would teach them intensive ways on small plots to raise enough food for their families. And these farmers came from miles and miles away to learn exactly how to do that. They even had a beekeeping course, which I thought was fantastic, because I'm an amateur beekeeper myself. You see, the church in Kenya is doing far more than preaching the gospel. The Methodist Church is changing the way people live and offering them Christ as a vital resource for daily living. And that's the key. I think you all can take pride in the clear-eyed and practical work that's being done in the mission field through our worldwide United Methodist connection. I think you and I can take pride in the fact that our gifts to the church can make that kind of difference in that kind of place, in that kind of world. Because I've seen a similar kind of commitment in the community in Fort Lupton. I've seen the tender care that you exhibit to the least, the lost, and the lonely here in town and the surrounding area. I've witnessed the pride in relationships and connections throughout the region that you foster and encourage by your presence, your prayers, your gifts, your service, and yes, your witness. And this brings vitality. It brings futures to us. It brings possibilities to the ministry of this church, which you can rely on as we go forward day by day. But what about our personal faith? When we were in Kenya, we worked in meager circumstances. We met hundreds and hundreds of willing and spirit-filled disciples of Jesus Christ. Now, they weren't all Methodists, but time and again when I was able to share with them and introduced as a Methodist pastor, I learned that many of our local co-workers with whom we were sharing the work were from the area Methodist church. The carpenter Muti was a Methodist. The chairman of the school was a Methodist. The hardest worker of all the parents, John, was a steward at the nearby Warera United Methodist Church, as were the former chief and the community's present chief, or mayor, if you would. The wannabe beekeeper, Wilfred, was a Pentecostal, but he'd been raised a Methodist, so it was all good. Now, I don't think they were just telling this to please me or to fit in. It was a delight to us all to share this heritage as we worked side by side on God's behalf for their community. Here, we learned of their absolute reliance and trust in God. One serious young man in another town, after hearing about some of the work we were about in Kenya, told me this, quote, "You Americans, everyone else comes to Kenya just to take pictures of the animals, but you Americans are the only ones who come also to help the Kenyan people. God bless you for what you're doing. God bless you." And he meant it. Sure, we asked for receipts to show the work that was done. Sure, we wanted photographs to see that the money we'd given had gone to the thing that we were supporting. Sure, we Americans had this practical notion of 1 + 1 = 2. Sure, we wanted things done in a certain way, but we were there to make the difference and to invest in the people. You see, I long for such self-emptying conviction to be shared among us as a sacred community in Fort Lupton. And I delight in seeing such a love expressed through this congregation. And I yearn for you to possess a faith of such character, such reliance and resilience, such resource, that it impresses others in its strength and its authenticity. But first then, faith has to mean something to you. And faith has to be employed by us. And unfortunately, experience teaches us that such a generous faith only comes by significant suffering. Faith comes by suffering. And suffering is something that most of us try to avoid. Bishop Jake Owensby talks about suffering and offers us this wisdom. He writes, God responds to our suffering. God joins us in our suffering. God transforms our suffering and vindicates our suffering. In Jesus, compassion's heartbreak gives birth to an entirely new kind of life. A life that passes through death, never to look back in at the grave. So to love then, even when that love is breaking our hearts, means something, because holiness happens there. Why should we look to our suffering as something positive? Because with faith, holiness happens there. So in avoiding suffering at all costs, do we sacrifice our growth as human beings in the bargain? How are we preparing ourselves to love through our anguish onto a brighter day? How might we engage our times of distress to gain wisdom, to lift us to a whole other kind of living? Full of fear and trying to avoid all kinds of risk, trying to gloss over our misery, do we somehow miss out on the best parts of life? Whatever's coming next. Dr. E. Stanley Jones, with these words of wisdom over our natures, gives us more wisdom. He writes, I'm inwardly fashioned for faith, not for fear. Fear is not my native land, faith is. I am so made that worry and anxiety are the sand in the machinery of life. Faith is the oil. I live better by faith and confidence than by fear, doubt, and anxiety. In anxiety and worry, my being is gasping for breath. These are not my native air, but in faith and confidence I breathe freely. These are my native air. We don't exactly know why it's that worriers die sooner than non-worriers, he continues, but the fact is that they do. Dr. Jones continues, but I who am simple of mind think I know why that's the case. Because we're inwardly constructed, nerve and tissue, brain cell and soul, for faith and not fear. God made us that way. To live by worry is against reality. To live by worry is against our natures. Our project in Warrera Primary School, with no running water and no electricity and no glass in the windows, some 270 children come every day to learn in bare dirt classrooms without books. They walk from their meager packed earth and tin roof shacks and tread oxen cart paths beaten into fine red dust. They play with makeshift toys, which are ingenious, by the way, on wind-blown playground, but in neat school uniforms that are remarkably clean for their circumstances. Boys and girls, the future of Kenya, they struggle daily for what we take for granted. Now, by our standards, these of God's children live in primitive and poor conditions, but they have learned to live richly and generously for God. How did that happen? And they pray with a sense of urgency and intensity that is so compelling that I can never forget them or their prayers. Maybe it's as simple as a friend in need is a friend indeed, and so they turn to God, their friend, to make life happen. Maybe it's as simple as a people living so close to survival experience faith differently than we do. But when we are in those circumstances, in the midst of our daily need, we can seek the Lord of all creation, not the gods of pride or place or arrogance or ownership so much as the God of life, the Lord of light. In the midst of suffering, they claim a wisdom and a reliance upon God that is really rare among us, opening themselves, I believe, to a joyful life with Christ that's inseparably grounded from their faith in God. See, it's not just enough to have a faith that accompanies us, but to live by faith that challenges us, that shapes us, that supports us, that molds us. It's not enough to pay lip service or sing a pretty song, as pretty as the song might be. A faith that makes the difference is the one that we live, is the one that we drink in, is the one that we share with others. St. Paul, in this passage from the Hebrews, in his letter to them, speaks of many ways that by faith the people of Israel endured suffering to gain their reward. Moses and the Exodus, the conquest of Jericho, the building of nations in the sight of God, especially the Hebrew nation. And he goes on to add some contemporary examples in the Roman arena. Jeers and flogging, chains and imprisonment, many sawed in two and killed by the sword, but by faith and with extraordinary courage, they who would not renounce Jesus Christ gained for themselves a better resurrection. So, we're to live by faith, not idly passing the time in the lap of luxury. I didn't know you realized that's where we were. But bearing witness to the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who is Jesus Christ,